let's get started. I know people will be coming in. We're going to do standard sort of first day things today. I'll go over the syllabus, that kind of stuff. I also will, after we do that, I'll spend a little bit of time just talking about the syllabus as I normally do. Many of you have had me for classes before, you know how this goes. So, on the first day, I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff at you and lecture. By no means do I expect you to memorize and master and have under your belt all this stuff, and we'll build on that. That's not how this is going to be. I'm going to lay out some initial questions today. I'm about to give you 4. We're going to work on 2. I'm going to lead you into that stuff in a historical manner first, but also then in a textual manner. We'll get to the 2 texts I assigned for you today. What you see up here on the screen is an outline of the preface to the phenomenology. I also have an outline, I'll flip it over when we get there, to the preface to the science of logic. Both those are on the D2L site, so you don't have to frantically try to copy them down or take pictures of them. I have a section on the D2L site that will have all the outlines posted to them. I'll usually post those pretty much the day of class. I don't be looking for them too much earlier than that, but they'll be there by then. These little, just so you know how this works, these are paragraph marks. See, paragraph marks. Those refer to the Miller paragraphs, right? So the Miller translation is not the one I'm using. I'm using the Cambridge translation, but it took it over as well. So when Miller did his translation, he thankfully numbered all the paragraphs in the entirety of the phenomenology, and that's actually been adopted by German scholars now. They even use those as well. So these are Miller paragraph numbers here. If we were talking about the encyclopedia, that's Hegel's paragraphs, but here they are Miller's paragraphs. Anyway, they match up this way. As I tell you in this little note down at the bottom, this is in accordance with, well, some of it's in accordance with Hegel, some of it's in accordance with other things. The breakdown is me and others, right, trying to figure out where those things actually match up with the paragraphs. So that's a kind of roadmap, rough roadmap to what's going on in the text. That's where that'll be on D12, so you'll be able to find that usually before class, or just before class, for the material that we're working on that particular session. I'll try to get them up earlier. I know some of you will use those when you're doing the readings. That can be helpful for that, so I will try to get them up earlier, but I promise to have them up at least by the day of class. I think that's that. Let's take a look at the syllabus. It really hasn't changed. I handed out a physical copy of it just now, but the actual syllabus hasn't changed. It hasn't changed since I sent it out quite a while back, but let's take a look at it for just a moment. So this is Hegel Science of Logic. Make sure you sign up for the right class. I always tell my undergraduates that. I'm Kevin Thompson. I always tell my undergraduates I'm a professor in philosophy at DePaul. If you want to call me professor, fine. I have a doctorate in philosophy, so you can call me Dr. Thompson if you want to. My name is Kevin, so you can also call me Kevin. And this is the joke, right? It's not so much a joke, it's actually true. My kids call me Hey You. I respond to all of those things. So whatever you're comfortable in calling me, I'm comfortable with you calling me that. So I'm not hung up on the formalities. Whatever you want to call me is fine. My office has moved recently, and I know some of you went to the old office. I still try to go to my old office, so you're not alone. I literally walked out of one room, not like last week, and started going to my old office. I no longer am there, right? So my new office is in 150.1, I should say. It's the old administrative assistant office. The administrative assistant's now actually out at the main desk. I've got that office. That's where I'll be. If you need me, that's the place to find me. I'll be there on Tuesdays, every Tuesday guaranteed, 2 to 3, open office hours. You don't need appointments to come during that time. Although sometimes, some people sign up and I'll ask you to tell me when you're coming so I can monitor and arrange that a little better. But I'll meet with you any other time you want to meet, either on Zoom or we can meet in the office if that works better for you. But I'm on campus on Tuesdays. I'm here a lot of Fridays, I'm here a lot of Thursdays. So whenever you need me, we can pretty much work it out. You see my office, the department, my office doesn't have a phone anymore. Most of our offices don't have phones anymore. So, I'll give you that just in case you need to get a message to me. You can call the front desk. But the best way to contact me is through email. Right? So send me an email if you want to get in contact with me. The next bit you see on the syllabus is a description of the course. It's the same one you see on the course description, so I won't belabor by reading it because we've already been through that. The texts that are required for the course, this is the required text for the course, is the Science of Logic, the Cambridge edition, Cambridge edition translation of the Science of Logic. We are going to read that entire book over 20 weeks. Right? So if you've seen the syllabus, you know that. I'm just reminding you, that 800-page book we're actually going to read. We won't read every last page of it, right? Because that would be impossible. But we're going to read all the main pages of it, and we'll talk about how to do that getting closer to it. There's a couple recommended texts. The recommended texts are really that. I'm not going to be talking about them in class, so if you just want to use them as a parallel reading, you can certainly do that. There's plenty enough to read in the main text, right? So I'm not going to give you that. I give you the parallel text, I give you the recommended text in the encyclopedia, both the 1817 edition, that's what one of those is, and the 1830 edition, which is what the other one is. You can take a look at those if you'd like to compare and contrast. I know several of you were in the Encyclopedia Logic class. We used the 1817, 1830 edition of the encyclopedia to talk about the logic in that class. So if you want to kind of pair those up and look at those and have fond or horrific memories from those, that's how to figure out, oh, he's talking about this in the science of logic, which he wrote earlier. Right? What's called the greater logic, right? And that's called the lesser logic. Encyclopedia Logic, the science of logic itself. The requirements, it's probably the most important thing you can get out of me today, at least in terms of syllabus-wise, is the requirements for the course. So there's one requirement for the autumn quarter, there's one requirement for the winter quarter. Remember, you don't have to continue on in the class. You can take the autumn quarter and you want to bail after that. No problem with that at all. So you would just have this one requirement. If you stay on for the winter quarter, then you'll have this additional requirement. But the one requirement for the autumn quarter is one exegetical paper. It's 1,500 to 2,100 words. It'll be due via D2L at 11:59 p.m. That is Monday, November 25th. That's the last day I can get it and still get in grades in time. So please don't ask for extensions. That's what I've already factored in your extension. If you want to put it that way. So you've been given an extension already, but it's November 25th. That's the very. I'll take them earlier, but that's the last. So about halfway through the course, this is how these exegetical assignments run. Those of you who had classes before, it's the standard exegetical assignment. Those of you who hadn't, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 to 4 passages. You're going to select one. And you're going to give me an exposition, an explication of that passage. No secondary sources used. It's just you and the text making sense of that stuff. And you can't quote Hegel to explain Hegel, because that doesn't work. Right? More obscurity doesn't make the obscure helpful. It doesn't clarify. So you'll actually have to explain it as best you can in your own words. Tough to do. We'll talk more about it when you're there. It is an exercise. I think of it as an exercise. It's an incredibly important exercise. You're not arguing for a thesis. You're not writing a research paper. We'll do that in the winter quarter. It's enough to just try to figure out what the hell is Hegel saying. Right? So the basic assignment will be this. I'll give you a passage you've selected. You'll either have an argument in that passage and you've got to explicate the argument, or you'll have the conclusion to an argument and you need to reconstruct the argument. Explain what he's saying and reconstruct the argument by which you got to that conclusion. More about that when we get there, but that's what you'll be handing me in. I don't do class presentations. I don't, you don't do performance dance. None of that. It's enough to do the readings in this material. That's hard enough, challenging enough. You'll have to deal with me feebly telling you about what's going on at Hegel, and hopefully that will be helpful enough. I will try to exemplify, not so much today, but certainly going forward. I'll exemplify for you what I'm looking for in the exegetical assignments, because I'll do it every week. The exegetical assignment is what's in the assignment for me to do every week, so that's what I'll be doing for you, and I'll look for some of that, something like that from you. Assignments. In the winter quarter, if you choose to stay on, then you'll do a thematic paper, no less than 3,000, no more than 4,500. That's plenty enough. Again, due through D2L. March 26th is the due date on that one. That's a standard research paper. You will be required to use secondary sources. Remember, I banned those from the exegetical assignment. I'm going to require those for the research thematic paper. You'll have till March 22nd to turn it in. Don't ask for extensions. I've already got the extension factored into it. That's the last date I can get it and get in winter quarter grades. That makes sense. Questions issued? I mean, you'll have tons more questions as we get there. You'll figure out what you want to write on by then. But the nice thing about, I think, you tell me, the nice thing about doing it this way, doing an exegetical assignment in the autumn quarter, doing a thematic paper in the winter quarter, is you really don't have to come up with a topic, right, for the autumn quarter. Right? You're going to see passages. I'll give you like 4 passages. You're just going to pick one. Right? So you pick that passage and you get to work on it. That's it. You'll have 4 options to work from, or 3, however you get on the you'll be off and running. So this class, at least, you won't have to figure out, what am I going to write on in that class? You'll know. I'll give you options to write on. You'll pick one. The winter quarter, though, you want to think about, what do I want to work on in this quarter? And it's completely fine for you to build on your exegetical assignment. Right? So if you want to use your exegetical assignment and say, I'd actually like to explore that in more depth. I'd like to do something with that. You can absolutely do that. You don't have to, but you can absolutely do that. So you can use that as a stepping stone into your thematic paper in the winter. I'll give you the critical edition information for Hegel. Those are the critical editions for the Science of Logic, obviously. Those come in also the minor editions is what I recommend, so you can get those as well. If you have any facility in German at all, Hegel doesn't make more sense in German, right? I'm not about to say that. That's just not true, right? You can ask any German. It does not help. Right? But what does help is if you have any facility in German at all, if you can recognize terms, it helps for you to pull up this book, right, where he wrote this stuff, pull it open and see, oh, here are the terms he's using. Here's what that means, and start connecting those things together. It's a way of building your vocabulary. It's a very good philosophical vocabulary that Hegel's using here, very useful, despite his own particular ways of defining things. Right? I'll try to remind you what those original definitions would be. Most of them are in Kant. They come from Kant, frankly, so we'll talk about it in those terms. But Hegel does have a rich philosophical vocabulary. You want to familiarize yourself with it. The more you do that, the richer your German philosophical vocabulary will be. And frankly, the way to start that is just to stare at a German page. If you can't make heads or tails out of the sentences, you're still okay. You're helping yourself by acquiring knowledge of those terms. So I recommend highly using the German for the class. Those of you who do have facility in German will be using it a little bit in the class and helping us through passages. You'll see, I work from the German, so you'll see that I will correct the translation sometimes. I'll suggest other ways of translating sometimes because I find it helpful, not just to, oh, they missed this little nuance. Okay, fine. But if it's philosophically substantial, I'll try to make a point out of it, and I'll alert you when that's going on. All right, if you take a look over on the back, there's recommended secondary sources. Remember, I told you can't use these, right, for your exegetical assignment. You can't. Didn't say you couldn't look at them, right? You just can't refer to them in your exegetical assignment. But these are really helpful secondary sources. I picked them because I thought, well, look, you need some general introductions to Hegel, as we're about to hear in just a moment. Some of you haven't really necessarily had any familiarity with Hegel at all. If you're in the right class, you're fine. And then I picked some, obviously, that focus specifically on the science of logic. So you've got a long list here. So let me make a couple of more concerted recommendations as to what I think is really useful, helpful, introductory level books here that would be useful to you. So the first one out of the general books would be Stephen Holgate's Introduction to Hegel, Freedom, Truth, and History, 2nd edition. Holgate's just an excellent reader of Hegel, an excellent expositor of Hegel. I highly recommend his works in general. This one in particular is, if you've never read Hegel, he leads you gently into Hegel and will help you along the way. It's not a commentary on the science of logic. He's writing that, right, and has written already some of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the class as we go through. But that's the one I would highlight out of all those to recommend to you. The other one I would look at would be G.R.G. Muir. It's an old book, Philosophy of Hegel, but it's really good. It's really good, short, and it's really authoritative. It's a really quite nice book. Doesn't cover everything. It's not meant to, but if you've never read any Hegel and you want to kind of get what's going on here, that'd be a good book that I would go to and take a look at. All right, now in terms of the science of logic itself, I think as I just mentioned, Stephen Holgate's books, The Opening of Hegel's Logic, and he's got Hegel on Being. He's got volume 1's out, volume 2's out as well. I've just got volume 1 here, but volume 2's out. Well, I think they're both together. So that's good. G.R.G. Muir is A Study of Hegel's Logic is an excellent book. Off the top of my head, those are the ones I would pick out. All these are excellent, or they wouldn't be on the list, right? But those are excellent ones there. And the books by Burbage, John Burbage, on Hegel's Logic, Fragments of the Commentary, is a really good commentary. It's fragments, so it doesn't literally go along with every passage you might want to find a commentary on. But it is really good. And the short book he wrote called The Logic of Hegel's Logic, an Introduction. I love that book because it's only about 50 pages at max. And it actually does cover the entirety of that 800-page work we're going to be reading. Not in detail, right? But it really does tell the story, right? The overarching account in a quite accessible way. Right? I don't agree with everything. I don't agree with any of these people. Right? That's just the nature of the field. But it really is good at an introduction level of grasping what's going on. So if you get lost, when you get lost, right, you will get lost in the science of logic. We all do. And you need to have someone tell you, hey, what's going on over the overarching thing going on here? What's the master narrative? Use that term for it. Burbage is a really good, reliable source for that. He gives it to you in a pithy, concise way. So it doesn't capture everything, but it's useful for that. All right, then you'll see the reading schedule, standard sort of thing here. It's on the front and the back. The reading schedule is telling you what I'm going to be talking about that day. So I'm going to hold you to being, I try to make these doable. So that's why you see in like on the, where are we at? So the doctrine of being is the place where this gets the worst. Like in October 1st, 8th, and 15th, I've got you reading, this passage, what am I skipping? I'm skipping the stuff that are remarks. Right? So there's a lengthy remark, famous remark on calculus, right? Goes on for 30, 40 pages. I'm not going to be talking about that in lecture. If you guys want to talk about it, I'll be glad to talk about it. It's wonderful, interesting stuff, but we would be stuck in that and never make it out of that, and we'd never read the entirety of the book. So that's why I'm skipping over those passages. That's why you have the weird assignments where it says read, like pages 152 to 155, then skip over to 165. That's the flow of the arguments, what I'm tracking. The other stuff is the remarks. Hegel wrote those, right? But we're not going to be able to attend to them in this class. You see much less of those in the essence logic, even less of those in the concept logic. So that's what I'm going to be that's what I'm going to be talking about, lecturing on each week. I may be off on those, but I'm going to ask you, unless I announce in class a major change, stay current with those readings, stay up with those readings. If you'll do that, I'll catch you along the way. I may not, the last stuff you read, I may not get to in the lecture. I may take that up in the next lecture. That'll be fine. But I need you to go ahead and read it. Right? So be sure you read all the way through those. I've tried to make them, you're going to kill me some weeks because they're a little lengthy. Guilty as charged. But generally speaking, you should be able to read these and come to class, read them carefully, read them thoroughly, read them with all sorts of questions that are going to come out of them. One of the basic questions is, what the hell did that say? Right? If you don't have that question in the science of logic, you probably didn't read it. Right? So ask that question, read the text. That's the question you'll ask. You see the schedule for the autumn quarter, then you see the schedule for the winter quarter as well as on the back. The basic idea is to read what's called the objective logic, that is the logic of being and the logic of essence, in this quarter, which is 10 weeks, which is a large, challenging goal, but doable. Right? It is doable. I've taught this course, it's like the 4th or 5th time I've taught it. That's what we do. Right? And then we begin in the winter quarter by rereading something you already read. Right? We reread the actuality chapter again because it's that important. It's transitioned. As you're about to hear throughout this course, the transitions are always important. That transition is the cornerstone of the book, right? It doesn't fly, the book doesn't work. So we'll talk about that one in 2 different sessions for that reason. It also allows you over the wonderful December break to read the same thing again. Right? Not have to read ahead and get it ahead. You can read what you've already read and remind yourself, oh yeah, that is difficult. That is hard. That is what's going on. And then we'll proceed through the rest of the logic, the concept logic for the rest of that quarter. And then we'll end by reading the preface to the 2nd edition. Talk more about that when we get there. Hegel was actually working on in his death. He wrote the preface to the 2nd edition. It never got published in his lifetime. He died in 1831. That's when his preface was being written. He was revising the phenomenology and the science of logic, his first 2 major works, in his death year. Right? And so he revised a lot of the book, Logic of Being. Right? So I'll try to point some of those out to you. There's much more to be done with it, but we'll talk about a little bit of it. But that's why we're going to read that preface at the end, because that's, as always, you write the preface at the end of the book. That's when he wrote this preface we're about to talk about. Both the prefaces was written. The preface of the phenomenology was written after the phenomenology was written. The preface to the first edition of the Logic was written after the first edition came out in 1813, at least that first volume came out. So we'll talk about those, but we'll look at the preface of the 2nd edition then, because it's substantially later. That's when he wrote that, so it's worth thinking about what he's trying to address there, trying to grapple with there. A lot of rich stuff in that preface. Then the last thing is really for those who are looking at the assignment in the encyclopedia. It's on the back page. I won't go into that because it's really just a note if you're reading along in the encyclopedia. What is Hegel? What's not Hegel? What's worth reading? What's worth holding, in a lower stature in terms of how you read it. I think that's enough of me. Here we go. So what I want to do now is turn to the main body of the lecture we're going to do. But before we do that, I want to get everyone a chance to introduce themselves. I know you've heard each other's names. If you've been in classes with one another, you've heard those things already. And in other settings, you've heard those. But I always think it's worth hearing here. So tell us, I'll just go around the room. You can introduce yourselves. I'll start here with Jose. But first thing I want to hear from is your name, where you are in the university or in the program, and then what, if any, and I mean that seriously, if any, familiarity we have with Hegel. Right? Have you ever read Hegel before? Jose, sir.
Yeah, Jose, I'm from the sociology department, and this is my second time that I try to understand Hegel with Karen.
Didn't work the first time. My fault.
Thank you.
Karen.
I'm Feli. This is my third year in the PhD program, and I took Hegel, I think, last year. Yeah.
You were before this.
I'm Alex. I'm second year in the PhD, and I have read Hegel before. Not this whole world stuff.
I'm Nelson. I graduated from undergrad, so I'm not part of the program that I wanted to sit in. I have like no familiarity with Hegel, basically. So, yeah.
I'm Caroline. I'm a fourth year in the philosophy PhD program, and I've read a decent amount of Hegel, but haven't doing the entire greater logic. I'm Kathleen. I'm a third year in the program, and I also took part in the Sache 2 years ago on the theologic, but never read the greater logic.
Hi, I'm Sache. I'm a third year. I've written my writing sample on Hegel, and I took the encyclopedia class. And I read a little bit about science of logic. And I'm trying to write a project on Hegel.
Hi, I'm Ken. I'm a third year in the PhD program. I was also a part of the encyclopedia logic class 2 years ago.
Harry, I'm in the third year, and I too was in the encyclopedia class 2 years ago.
Hi, I'm Bram. I'm a first year in the PhD program. I did take a Hegel seminar at Penn State. We read the phenomenology, and we read through his lectures on history. I feel good about the history lectures, do not feel good about the phenomenology.
I'm a fifth year sitting in. I was also in the seminar 2 years ago, and I read a decent Hegel besides that, but I feel like every time I stop reading Hegel actively, it all falls out of my head. I need to start all over.
Hi, John. I'm a fourth year student in the program. I was also in the encyclopedia seminar, and I feel the same way. I have read Hegel since.
I'm Carrie. I'm a student at Loyola, and I've read very little of Hegel.
I'm Neo. I'm also a student at Loyola. Read a decent amount of Hegel. I'm doing my master's thesis on philosophy of nature.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm in the second year of the PhD program. I read phenomenology and the philosophy of right before, but I never read science of logic.
Hey, hi, I'm the first year student at the program. I've read the phenomenology, but never the greater logic.
Hi, I'm Nick Leo. I'm also first year in the program, and I have read the preface to phenomenology sphere before, and was surprised to find that this time it's even more difficult. Yeah.
Cool.
Hey, I'm a second year. I've worked on the phenomenology, the philosophy of right, and some of the introductions to his lectures on various things, but I've never worked on the logic or the encyclopedia.
Hi, my name is Sura. I'm a first year PhD student. I never read Hegel deep, but I read.
I'm John. I'm a recent graduate of got a master's in pure mathematics. I've heard of Hegel. I can spell Hegel, and that's it.
Sujita, and I had the misfortune of doing my master's in a very Hegel-heavy program, a department. So I read a lot of Hegel, but I don't think I really care. It didn't work.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a first year student in the philosophy program, and I have read very little Hegel directly, but I am familiar with his thought a little bit through philosophers who have commented on it.
So I go around and do that, as many of you know, so for a couple reasons. One, it helps me kind of know what the lay of the land is in terms of familiarity with Hegel. As you just heard, it's all over the map, right? And that's perfect, in my view. That's exactly what a class like this should be about. So I'm glad to have that. The other reason I do it is so that you guys know where everyone's at. And one of the things I really think is important to hear as you listen to people where they're at in the program is they have different familiarity with Hegel, right? Some of them have read him a lot, some have read him none, some have no clue, some of them have no clue even after reading him several times. I mean, it's all like that. And that's perfect in my view. My job is to speak and meet all of you to try to understand what's going on. Right? Now, this is not the best book for that, right? So let's just acknowledge something from the outset. I had a former student remind me recently that she took this class as her first class in grad school, like some of you are doing, and she said it felt like a train was being run, she was being run over by a train. And I said, in that analogy, am I the train? She said, yeah. So it's not beautiful, right? It's not good, and I think that's probably an accurate description of how this is going to feel in some regards, right? So I'm warning you. But having said that, I'm trying to make Hegel, even in this very non-introductory level text in Hegel, there's really not that too many introductory level texts in Hegel, let's be honest. The other candidate would be the phenomenology. Trying to make it speak to you. So what I need from you is to do this, right? If you'll give me, this is what I ask of you, if you'll give me the commitment to work through this material as best you can, and to bring to class your honest questions. Those questions can be as uninformed, you might think this is uninformed, as what does that mean? What is he saying there? I think those are brilliant questions. Every time I've taught this class, when someone's asked that kind of question, we've all benefited immensely from those kinds of questions. So please, never fail. You are welcome. Someone may have a very sophisticated sounding question, may have a very erudite question. Kevin, what's this nuance of this mean? How does this compare to this encyclopedia? Oh, great. I'm here for that as well. But also know that the very simple questions are oftentimes the most profound and the best. I remember one time I was teaching the science of logic. We were talking about, as we will in a few weeks, the opening passages on being. And after I've been through it for a little while, about halfway through the class that day, one of the students, first year students, said, "What is being for Hegel?" We've just been trying to work on it. I said, "Well, it's nothing." She goes, "Right, that's what the hell does that mean?" Right. I didn't say, "Well, we talked about that for the last hour and a half." I said, "Okay, let's talk about it, because that is the issue. Let's make sense of that as best we possibly can." Now, I'm not claiming that I can make every line in this text make perfect sense to you, right? That's not the job here. But I can, I think, and I will strive to make each one of the categories make some sense to you, show you how the transitions work, and ultimately my goal is to have you walk out of here, if you stay through the 20 weeks, certainly, but even if you just stay in the first quarter, you have a sense of what the overarching argument of the book is. So it's 800 pages, but it's really just one argument all the way through. There's a lot of detail to that argument, but there is an overarching argument, what I call a master argument of the logic. We'll talk about that as construct that along the way, and hopefully that, in connection with the actual details of the various different moments and transitions, together that'll make some sense, right? Help you make some sense of the book, and ultimately help you make some sense of Hegel. My goal for you is not to say I mastered the logic in that class. My goal for you is to say I've got a good sense of what's going on. I think at the very core of what's going on in Hegel, because that I do think about this book. This is the book. If you asked me what's the most important book in Hegel's corpus, it's this one. He wrote 4 books. I know our bookshelves are full with a lot more books that are attributed to him. He wrote 4 books. He wrote a phenomenology, he wrote the science of logic, he wrote the encyclopedia in 3 editions, and he wrote the philosophy of right. That's the only 4 books that he published. That's the only 4 books he wrote. There's a lot of lectures out there. Those are student auditors' notes on what he wrote. There's a lot of youthful stuff that he didn't publish, right? All this kind of stuff. But of the 4 books that he published, this is the heart and soul of Hegel. He tells you in all the other books. I explain that in the science of logic. I go into that in more depth. This is all rooted in the science of logic. It's the only book he does that to. He doesn't say that about the phenomenology. He doesn't say that about anything in the encyclopedia. It's constantly, if you want to know more about that, I covered that in this book. Even in the philosophy of right, he says, this book, you can't understand any of it. Sorry. You can't understand any of it without that book. So, at least, now, he may be deluded, right? Let's always remember, Hegel's not right because Hegel says it, right? You'll say that a lot when you read this book, right? He's not right just because he said it. Because first of all, we got to figure out what he said, right? And then, is he even right about that? That's the second question. But he's certainly not right because he said it. And he's not right because he thought it was a central book. I think you will find, however, that it does prove out to be that. It is a central book for him. If you want to know what the core of Hegel's thought is all about, he's telling you in this book. The other books are all gesturing towards it. This book's actually trying to set it out. So with that advertisement, let's call it that, for why we ought to read the Science of Logic, let me set out what I want to do. So a warning, as I gave you just a moment ago, I'm going to give you a bunch of stuff today. So what's basically going to happen, I'll watch the clock. There's one in the back of the room. I'll keep up with things. I'll lecture. I'll do mostly historical stuff for reasons I'll talk about here in just a moment. The first half of the class, those of you who've been in the Encyclopedia of Logic will go, I've heard that before, right? You've heard much of that before. But it's always good to hear it again, right? Get you refreshed and set up again. You might have different questions about it this time. We'll take a break, just about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back, and then we should be, if I do my job correctly, if I'm off, it's my fault. We should be on to the text of the material, so I'll look at selected portions from the preface to the phenomenology. You'll see why we're looking at selected things. I'll try to highlight those. So I'm not going to give you a careful paragraph by paragraph reading of the preface to the phenomenology, but I am going to do that to the preface to the Science of Logic for obvious reasons. That's the book we're reading. But the preface to the phenomenology is a useful text in a lot of ways, and it's useful for reasons I'll talk about in introducing these and addressing some of these basic questions about Hegel's thought. That's going to be roughly, that's the plan for today. In the future, I'll come in and review what I did last time, lecture, you ask questions. That's the way I operate. I'm not one of those professors that comes in, throws the book down and says, hey, what'd you guys think about that? Because that's a disaster, right? With this book. Who knows, whatever. You all sit out there and stare at me, rightly so, waiting for me to say something of sense, because that was all nonsense and gibberish. And I'm going to look at you and go, well, did you understand? And that's not going to be useful. Right? So I'm going to come in, I'm going to try to give you what I think is a decent reading of the material, and you stop me along the way and ask questions. And I'll look up every once in a while and ask you, right? And try to lecture about the things in more depth and try to address your question. Fair enough? All questions are valid. The only questions that's not valid is, or were we supposed to read that? It's on the syllabus. Okay. Questions, issues, problems so far?
That was my next question.
Yeah, there you go.
We were supposed to read.
There you go.
No, were we supposed to read the phenomenology of spirit today?
Not all of it, no. Just the preface.
Just the preface.
Yeah, just what's assigned there on the syllabus. Other questions make sense? All right. So I'm going to start off with, and I do this usually in most of my seminars, so this is a standard sort of practice here. I want to lay out 4 basic questions that will organize what we're going to do throughout the rest of the quarter. So these questions are not just for today. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today, 2 of them next time. They'll be the primary focus during those sessions, but they'll really be at issue for the next 20 weeks. So in some form or fashion, we'll be talking about them in some way or another. So here's the first question. What is the fundamental issue? Let's call it, what is the basic problematic? So I'll use the term problematic for this. That is at the very core of Hegel's thought. You might say, what is Hegel always striving to think? I do really think there is something that he's always striving to think. What is that? We're going to try to articulate that. So that's the first question. What is that fundamental issue, that problematic? What's the Sache, selbst? Second question, what is the project of the Science of Logic? So not only what is he trying to think in general, so what's Hegel's sets of thought he's trying to grapple with, but what's the project of this book we're reading and how it's related to that thought? So what is the project of the Science of Logic? What is he trying to do or accomplish uniquely in this work? Not in any of the other, not the encyclopedia, not in the phenomenology, not in the philosophy of right. So that's the second question. Those are the 2 we're going to look at most closely today. Right? So we'll look at those 2 questions. That's a mouthful and enough. Here's the third question. What is the critique, or what are the critiques of Hegel's thought that have served to set the agenda through which his subsequent readers, including ourselves, come to his work? So this is kind of unusual, but I think it's really important. Hegel's been criticized, right? Repeatedly, maybe obnoxiously, but certainly all the time. And a lot of people have set their philosophies off over against Hegel, or at least the Hegelian tradition. And I'd like to look at some of those criticisms, broad terms for those, and to set a context for us to read Hegel. Not because we have to agree with those critiques, but to be mindful of those critiques. I want a critical understanding of the text. And one of the things you can do with Hegel is obviously get lost in the details. And we're going to get lost in details. That's appropriate. That's right. That's what a grad seminar should do. It should be in the weeds of this thought. But it should also stay in contact with, well, what's been the criticism of Hegel's thought about what he's trying to think, about what he's trying to do, this ambition that he's pursuing. Maybe it actually can't be fulfilled. And that's what these criticisms will be about. We'll talk about those more. I'll lay out a couple of them in general terms next time. Then the fourth and last question we're going to be grappling with in the class, and I'll talk about it more next session, is what are the basic hermeneutic paradigms, the interpretive paradigms, that define the lay of the land in terms of contemporary interpretations of Hegel's thought? So what are the schools of Hegelian interpretation? Right? Hegel interpreting Hegel's thought. So we'll talk about those. It's relevant particularly to this book, right? Because a lot of those are about this book, but not just about this book. They're about Hegel in general. So we'll look at those interpretive paradigms. There are four of them. We'll talk about them in the next session. We'll lay them out. Again, as a framework for us to use and consider when we're reading the text itself. Make some sense? So as I said, I'm going to focus on those first two. So I'm going to focus on the problematic of Hegel's thought and the project. Sorry for the alliteration. It helps me remember them. The problematic and the project of Hegel's thought. That's what we'll work on today. And I'm going to offer you a sketch, but I want to remind you it's just that. It's just a sketch of what I take to be the answers to those questions. So I think it's always good to start with some answers to questions and then see, well, those are fairly complex and demand really to be unpacked. So let me give an answer to the problematic. What's Hegel trying to grapple with? What's he striving to think? So this is about the best I can do with this. And it's going to have a lot of technical jargon in here. I apologize for that, but we're going to spend the rest of this quarter and next unpacking these answers. So throughout his mature thought, Hegel is, I believe, trying to think what he calls nothing more than the necessity of the concept. I know people say he's thinking a lot of, spirit, the great answer to that, recognition, but, people like to talk about that. All sorts of other things. When you ask Hegel, what are you trying to grapple with? What are you trying to think? He has this phrase he uses pretty regularly. He says, I'm trying to think the necessity of the concept. And you say, oh, so it's about necessity, right? I know what necessity is roughly, right? So it's a certain kind of modality. And concept, I know concepts, those are generalities. I've got to handle this. Okay, right? But that's not going to work because that's not actually what Hegel means, or that's not just what Hegel means by that phrase. So the other term he uses for that same phrase, what he's trying to think, is the necessity of the concept. The other term is not helpful either, but it is the term he uses for it. He says, I'm trying to think the idea. Well, you say, I know what an idea is. It's a mental content. Okay, no, not just that. So this is going to be the continual struggle with Hegel. He's going to use terms, and they're going to have a received traditional philosophical vocabulary definition. And you're going to think, I got it. And what I'm going to tell you repeatedly is, you got a place to start. Because he's going to work with each one of those. He's going to work with what we mean by necessity. He's going to work with what we mean by concept. He's going to work with what we mean by idea. By the time he's finished working with those, they won't look like they initially looked. They'll incorporate those almost every time. So there'll be something like the modality of necessity. There'll be something like concept. There'll be something like idea. But that won't be where you're at the end of those. He will mean that and a lot more. So I always like to say after that, what is that? Right? What's the necessity of the concept? What is the idea? And here's my best attempt, maybe not my best attempt, so it's an attempt to lay out what I think he means by those things in non-Hegelian jargon, non-technical vocabulary, all those. So what does he mean by the necessity of the concept? What does he mean by the idea? This is what I think he means by it. It is the logic of the generative process of determinate negation. The logic, so the structure, right, the rules for a process. Now, let's be honest. When I said concept and when I said idea, you didn't think process. Right, shouldn't. But that's precisely what Hegel thinks both of those terms ultimately cash out to mean. That they're not about their static generalities, like we think of a concept. They're not about an idea like mental content. They are not stable things at all. They actually both denote the same damn thing. which is what? A process. A process of what kind? Just some process? No, it's a process that's generative. That is to say, it produces things. Well, how does it produce things? Here's the big answer for Hegel. Through negation. He says this explicitly at the end of the preface to the Science of Logic. He says negation is not just negative. It's also positive. Now, that's almost kind of a toss-off line in the preface, right? He just says, because it's not negative merely, it's also positive, right? We all got that, so let's move. You should go, whoa, 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 whoa. Negation's always negative. That's where it's right there in the term. Negation, it's negating of something. It's the doing away, the canceling, the annulling, the abolishing of something, the extermination of something. It's not productive. And yet Hegel's claim, as far as I can tell, the core claim of Hegel, what all these other terms, concept, idea, spirit, what all those are ultimately referring to is that negation is not just negative, it's productive, it's positive. And that's what he means, that's why he calls it always determinate negation. Determination is Hegel's name for what makes something what it is. So what the necessity of the concept is ultimately about is a logic of generative determinate negation. Now notice, I tried a little bit to fill out what those claims mean. We got a long way to go to see how that works, what they actually mean, and most importantly for Hegel, what in the world could justify that claim? What could justify? What's the argument to actually justify such a claim, preposterous claim as that? So just to push this point home a bit more. So if you're talking about the necessity of the concept, you're talking about a process. That's not how we normally think of concepts. Let's just note that. Right? It's not how we think of ideas, not how we think of necessity. But let's just hone in on concept for a moment, because Hegel's going to. He does this at the end of the preface to the Science of Logic. He says, it's a concept, it's a universal. So we know what universals are. Universals are the property that things share. So it's a shared property among particulars. Or let's be a little more sophisticated about it, Kevin. A concept is, a universal is a class of which various things are members, instantiations. Hegel's going to say, I give you that. I know what a concept is. I know it can be a shared particularity. I know it can be an abstract class, but none of those actually exhaust what a concept is. A concept at its core is not those things. What's a concept at its core? Hegel will say a concept at its core is a genus. Aristotle. Now we know what we're doing, right? Genus of species, it's all good, right? The genera in Aristotle, those are just covering concepts, right? That's all they're covering categories. Hegel says, no, actually, they're concepts that generate their own specification. They particularize themselves. And by virtue of particularizing themselves, they generate individuality. Now that ought to be preposterous. You should listen to that and go, that's crazy talk. Because let's admit it, it sounds like crazy talk. And maybe it will be crazy talk. But we're going to see Hegel make that claim. That's arguably the central claim of the logic. And see him argue for that in this text. And we're going to get there by working through the very nature of being itself and then moving all the way back to that. So there's the problematic. What's Hegel trying to think? He's thinking the necessity of the concept. He's thinking the idea. What does that really mean? It means the logic of generative determinate negation. All right. What's the project of this book we're reading? What's it trying to do? So the Science of Logic, in that book, Hegel seeks to lay out the fundamentals of a genuinely post-critical, by post-critical I mean post-Kantian, more about that in just a minute, a post-critical, post-Kantian metaphysics. Now, as we'll find out next week, that's already to take a stand on the hermeneutic field, because I'm claiming that book's a book of metaphysics. And how do you understand that? What does that mean? We've got much more to talk about there. But already that's to say that book is a metaphysical book, not a non-metaphysical book. The stages we'll talk about next week is interpretation of Hegel is to say, was he a metaphysician or non-metaphysician? All that sort of stuff we'll talk about. But for the moment, let's take it. Right? We'll come back and complicate it next week when we look at the other paradigms. But for the moment, let's take it. Let's say it's a post-critical, post-Kantian metaphysics. More specifically, I would say the Science of Logic deduces So it's an argument. And elaborates, it does both as it works, right? Because that's how it operates. It deduces and elaborates. The fundamental, to use a little Husserlian language, formal ontological structures, the categories of reality. One of the hardest things to get in this book, because it comes up fairly early, is this thing about being and nothing, being just as nothing, nothing just as being. We'll get that, hopefully. And then Hegel will say, yeah, that's becoming. And someone will say at that point, well, you're right, becoming happens, in time. So I'm familiar with that. And Hegel's going to say, yeah, I'm not talking about that. Why? Because not one bit of this book is about time. Worth reminding you since you're in a Heidegger class. Not one bit of this book is about time. This does not claim that being is time. Right? The central argument of Sein and Zeit last time I checked. Right? It's not the claim here. The claim here is that all of this is more fundamental than temporality. Time comes up in the philosophy of nature for Hegel, not here. So one of our struggles is going to be, well, there's going to be some category in the logic, maybe every category in the logic, and you're struggling with it, trying to understand it. And you're going to say, could you give me an experiential example of that? And I'm going to say, actually not. I mean, I can give you one, but it's going to come with a whole bunch of baggage that's not there. Because it doesn't have experience. There's no subjective cognizer experiencing this particular category. There's no world that has time and space in it yet. None of that. So one of the real struggles is to restrain ourselves in reading this book, to hold back. It's a very, for 800 pages, it's an austere book. It's making very basic, fundamental claims. The argument of the objective logic is this: everything is in thoroughgoing reciprocity with everything else. That's the argument. That's the conclusion. The rest of it's an argument to that conclusion. And then the logic of the concept is, well, how did that get generated? By the concept, by determinate negation. There's the book. Now, it doesn't help you a lot, because what the hell does those things mean, and how do you prove any of that? But that is what he's going to argue. So you're going to have to let him, at least for the moment, as you're going through it, let him lead you. Let him see what see what you think. Be patient with it. Ask your questions about it, but be prepared to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm putting in things that are not there yet. Doesn't mean he's right? Doesn't make him right because you put in something that you shouldn't put in. We're going to talk about presuppositions and how you can't make presuppositions in a little bit, but it's going to be very difficult to restrain ourselves because that's all we have. We have the real world, right? We don't have the fundamental categorical structure of reality in front of us. We have the real world. We have nature, we have spirit, all the other things that are accrued upon that. But Hegel will say, strip all that stuff away, and here's what the fundamental nature of reality is itself. That's what's in these categories. So he's trying to lay that out. That is, he's trying to lay out the fundamental ontological structures of reality that flow from the necessity of the concept. That's the project of the book, in a nutshell. Post-critical metaphysics is laying out the categories of reality as they are generated by the logic of the necessity of the concept. So there's my answer to those two questions today. Now you'll say to me, Kevin, those don't make any sense. That's okay, because today they don't have to make sense. After 20 weeks, they ought to make some sense. That's the goal. So we'll try to make some sense of them. But to begin to make some sense of them, I want to do two things. So the first thing I want to do is historical. I want to reconstruct what I call the conceptual space, not just me, calls this the diagram. I want to talk about this thought space, the conceptual space of late 18th, early 19th century German philosophy. Because I don't think you can understand Hegel without that. Right? Hegel is a post-Kantian. He's not the only post-Kantian, but he's definitely a post-Kantian. And he means both of those. He's a Kantian. He's a post-Kantian. You need both of those designations to make sense of the conceptual space in which he's operating. And we'll be more specific about that. He's a particular kind of post-Kantian, right? And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So that's the historical reconstruction I would do.
Is there something different between Kantian and post-Kantian?
Yeah, I'll explain that in just a minute. Yeah, absolutely. We'll be there in just a little bit. So then I'll turn after that, after the historical side, I'll turn to the technical basis. We'll look at both of these prefaces that I assigned for you today and try to bear out some of what I've already been saying. See him saying it there in the nature of how these prefaces work and how they say what they're saying. So let's go to the historical first. I'm going to look at two what I call turns in this period. They're incredibly important, and they happen within, what, about 8 years of one another, 6 years of one another. The first is the transcendental turn, the Kantian critical philosophy. We'll talk about that for just a moment. And the date is important here because Hegel's referencing this in the preface to the Science of Logic. He says for the last 25 years, if you do the count, that's 1787. Well, he's mistaken, right? Because we all know the first critique was written, published when? 1781. The edition, we all know. So why is he talking about 1787? We'll see why. He knows what he's doing. So 1787. We'll talk about that. That's the transcendental turn. And then from there, we'll talk about 1795. 1795. This is the monistic term. And it's really, Hegel is a disciple of Hegel. We'll talk about Hegel here. There's no 1795. There is no Hegel without Hegel. There literally is no Hegel without Hegel. So we'll talk why in just a moment. Hegel. We'll talk more about it in just a moment.
It's a person.
Yeah. Poet.
So you said the what term? I didn't catch
The monistic. Yeah, sorry, monistic term. So let's talk first about the critical turn, the transcendental turn. This is 1787. So it might be thought, it's often said, that the impact of Kant's work on German thoughts, the impact of Kant's work on German thought was due to the immense success of the critique of pure reason. That's false. That's just literally false. So why? Well, in 1781, when the critique was first published, literally nobody cared about it. Well, Hamann cared about it. Most of the German circles of thought, intellectual circles, couldn't care less about that book. It made no impact whatsoever. Didn't get reviewed very highly. People weren't running to the bookstores to go read it. None of it. It was published again in 1787. There's the B edition, as we call it. Right? Then it was huge. Why? Here's why. So the real beginning of Kant's significance was not the publication of the first critique on its own. It actually follows because of someone else's work, not Kant's, but someone else's, Karl Reinhold. So here's the problem, right? Karl Reinhold, philosopher in Jena, this is why everybody went to Jena to study Kantian philosophy. They didn't go to Königsberg, where Kant was actually lecturing still at the time. They went to Jena because Jena was the center of critical philosophy. Why? Because Karl Reinhold said what? He said, look, we're engaged right now in this thing we call the pantheism controversy. It's a version of the faith versus reason debate. I'll give you a little bit of it in just a moment. And here's Reinhold's real contribution to that debate. He says, look, you can go to one extreme, absolute faith, pure faith as it was called, the side of Jacobi, right? Or you can go down the other side with Mendelssohn, pure reason. Both of them are disastrous in various ways. So we need someone to come along and give us, an analysis, an investigation, a scrutinization of reason itself. We need reason to critique itself. Well, thank God we've had that done. That's the critique. That's the project of Kant and the critique. The critique of pure reason is a self-critique of reason. It's reason critiquing itself. And what does it do? It finds it has limits to it. We'll talk about those limits in just a moment. Very quick overview, not the kind of depth you would get in the seminar, obviously, on Kant, but enough for our purposes. What does that do? It provides a middle path between the extremes of pure faith and the extreme of pure reason. So Reinhold made Kant successful, made people want to start reading the B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, because Kant provided the middle path between the extremes of pure faith and pure reason. How so? Because Kant famously introduced this notion of rational faith. Rational faith. The line from the preface to the B edition where he says, I had to restrict knowledge in order to make room for faith. That term restrict is aufhebt. We'll come back to that in Hegel. So Reinhold's central claim, in those, he published a set of letters, it's called the Letters on the Critical Philosophy, Letters on Kantian Philosophy he published them in 1786, 1787. And his central claim, as I just said, was that Kant provides us this missing middle path, this missing middle path of rational faith between the extremes that define the debate in the pantheism controversy, many different layers of this. I'm looking at just book one of them. Between pure faith, Jacobi, and pure reason, Mendelssohn. So here's that issue in the pantheism debate. There's more to be had there. If we had time, we would go into it. But let's at least look at that conflict there as it's manifest there. On the one hand, pure reason, think of Moses Mendelssohn. Pure reason demands that for all events, he's just following out the principle of sufficient reason. All reason does. It says for everything it must have a why. For everything it must be explicable, it must be explainable, it must have a ground. What's the ground of all things? So pure reason demands that for all events, for all things, an ultimate cause and ultimate ground must be found. And the claim, right, is that necessarily leads to pantheism, mechanism, and fatalism. Or as the accusation was made in the pantheism controversy against Mendelssohn, he was a Spinozist. That's a dirty pejorative term at the time. It means you were not a person of faith. You were abandoning the faith. You don't mean other things in just a moment, we'll see, but at least means. So pure reason posed then a decisive threat, this is the way it's thought of, to the integrity of faith and the morals and social institutions built upon it, for it, reason, appeared to undermine the notions of freedom and purpose. It just sent us down the route of fatalism and mechanism. If everything is explicable in terms of a cause, and that cause is mechanistic, then there is no freedom. There is no purpose. So society and its morals are all called into question. Jacobi had a name for that. He said, reason pursued to its ultimate end is ultimately completely destructive of everything. If it asks the why question, and it asks that literally of everything, this goes all the way back to the apology, right? This is what Socrates is accused of, constantly demanding the why question be answered, and that's corrupting the foundations of society. Here we see it again, right, welling up in the late 18th century in Germany. If you pursue the why question, that everything must have a ground, nothing can stand up to that question. Everything will fall apart. It will destroy literally everything. There will be nothing left. So Jacobi said, what pure reason leads to is the destruction of everything. It's not just Spinozism. It's not just fatalism, that's code word for fatalism, mechanism, and atheism. It ultimately leads to, and this is Jacobi's famous term for this, it leads to nihilism. Jacobi's the one, not Nietzsche, Jacobi's the one who introduced that term into philosophical thought. Because literally nothing is left over. Everything's destroyed by reason. That's what happens when you let reason loose and you demand of everything that it give an account of itself. There's one side of the pantheism controversy. The path of pure reason, Mendelssohn, leads to Spinozism, and Spinozism leads to nihilism. On the other hand, though, here now we look at pure faith. Jacobi is the representative of the other opposite side, so this is the battle between Mendelssohn and Jacobi, principally, at least his figures of his movements. What was said about Jacobi is, okay, look, what Jacobi said, let me start with that. Well, Jacobi would say, well, then this shows us that some things have to be left as a matter of faith. That some things you can't prove. Some things you can't demonstrate. Some things are not up to the challenge of reason. Like what? Oh, like the existence of God, that the will is free, that the world exists, that the soul is immortal, all the kind of basic trinkets of our belief in the world and our belief in morality, the things that seem to undergird and provide cogency and coherence to the social, political, intellectual worlds, moral worlds as well. So Jacobi wanted to say, look, there's some things that just don't admit of rational proof. And of those, we must have faith. He famously said, we must take a leap of faith. We must take a leap of faith. The saltus mortalis. But he says, but it was said about him then, well, if we go down that route, there's problems. What's the problem? Well, if belief is sufficient for something to be true, that God exists, that the world is out there, that the will is free, that the soul is immortal, those kinds of things, if that's enough, just to believe it, to hold it to be the case, that's what we mean by belief, then we just open ourselves up, not to nihilism, right, I get that, but we left ourselves up to fanaticism. Because you believe it makes it true. Then anything you believe is true. So there's the horns of the dilemma. Right? Go down the route of pure reason, you're going to end up in nihilism. go down the route of pure faith, you're going to end up in fanaticism.
Who was saying that part? Jacobi said, the grounds for reason will lead, for all reason, will lead to nihilism.
Yep.
But who says faith will lead to fanaticism?
Right, so that's Mendelssohn
That's Mendelssohn.
back against Jacobi. Roughly, I mean, Mendelssohn had supporters, right? He's dead. Did that. So it makes some sense. So as you can imagine then, 1786, 1787, Reinhold coming in and saying, hey, look, there's a third path between these two extremes. There's the missing middle path that Kant offers us. Why? Because Kant tells us, look, before we get involved in all these disputes about what can and can't be proven, we ought to see if reason's up to the task of doing any of that. We ought to see if reason can actually do what reason's demanded to be done by the pure rationalists. And we ought to see if that requires a rejection of what those of pure faith demand. Or possibly could they be reconciled in some way, form, fashion with one another? Could faith and reason, pure faith, pure reason, be reconciled in what Kant proposes a rational faith? Now, I'm not going to stay with the pantheism controversy. I just want to show that's the context in which they read, in which Kant's thought was initially received. And so that was the principal thing. So when they talk about the critical philosophy, this is the way they think about it. We tend to obsess about other things in the critical philosophy. We think about other things and, how do we understand the B deduction in the first critique? That's not their obsession. Right? Their obsession was, okay, look, Kant, according to Reinhold, is solving a problem that we've got. That problem is you can't go down the route of pure faith, you can't go down the route of pure reason, you've got to go down the route of rational faith. Kant himself contributes to the debate in this piece called What is Orientation of Thinking? Poses this belief there. Now, here's the interesting thing about Reinhold, and here's how he sells Kant. He sees this as this intellectual dispute between pure faith and pure reason as an emerging catastrophe, obviously. It looks to be intractable, you can't get beyond it. But he said, this is a ripe time. You're going to hear this language in Hegel as well. This is the time that's ripe for a critique of reason. That's what we need now. We don't need to blindly follow down pure reason. We don't need to blindly follow down the route of pure faith. We need to look and step back for a moment and say, hey, what actually can reason do and what can't it do? And that's where Kant's first critique, we call it the first critique. They didn't know there were other critiques at the time. The critique of pure reason, that's what it was doing. So Kant comes in as a kind of mediator between these two extremes. That's why that line at the end of the B preface is so important, where he says, I had to restrict knowledge in order to make room for faith. He's literally saying reason is restricted in order to make room for faith, because there are some things that can't be demonstrated. God freedom and immortality among them. But just because we can't prove them doesn't mean that we can't believe them. But just because we say we want to believe them, that would lead to fanaticism. We have to have reason to believe them. How does that work? That's what he's trying, what the economist is trying to do. So his ultimate goal, Kant's ultimate goal, is very clear about this in many places, also in the first critique. We kind of get lost in the epistemic details of the first critique. We miss this sometimes. But Kant's ultimate goal, he's very clear about this in the prefaces, A and B edition, is to center this notion of human autonomy, self-governance. Self-governance. He says this in the What is Enlightenment piece very clearly. He says, all of this, all critique is ultimately the service of what? The construction of autonomy, for us to be self-governing beings. But that means that we'll be freed from the tutelage of dogmatism and tradition. So Kant's also a kind of destroyer. He was read that way, but not an ultimate destroyer. He's not a nihilist. Now, how do you go about that? How do you go about establishing that we're self-governing? What does that even mean here? How does that operate when you're talking about something like rational faith? So the key to working out a demonstration like that, according to Kant, was the introduction of what he believed was a radically new approach. This is Kant in a nutshell. So not all the nuances and details, but here's the basic approach. He says, look, we've been trying for thousands of years to solve the problems of metaphysics. We've been trying out this pure reason thing. Let me give you the report card. Ultimate disaster. Hasn't made an advance in anything. Metaphysics is a shambles, it's worthless, it's crap. It hasn't made one step of progress at all. What's the problem? Is the problem the questions? He thinks no, the problem's not the question. The questions, we'll talk about which questions in just a second, but the questions are questions that reason poses to itself. They're inescapable questions. They're questions that reason wants an answer to. Like what? Like this. Does God exist? Is the will free? Is the soul immortal? Now, there's varieties and variations of those questions, but ultimately what they're asking for is, what about the foundations of all things? That's really what it's aspiring to. You could say it's asking, this will be in the context of Hegel, makes even more sense. It's asking about the absolute. It wants to know things as they truly are. Does God exist? Is the will free? Is the soul immortal? Kant's claim, of course, is that those questions, which have been the centerpieces of traditional metaphysics, does God exist? Rational theology. Is the will free? Rational cosmology, because that really is about the world. Right? It's about, is the world necessitarian or is it allow for freedom? And is the soul immortal, which is really a question about the soul, so it's a rational psychology question. Those fundamental disciplines in metaphysics that have composed metaphysics don't have answers. And they haven't had answers. And they're not going to get answers. Constantly. As long as we proceed down the pathway we've been proceeding. Now, Kant thinks this is really his contribution to make. This is really what he's trying to do. His claim is this: look, if we're going to get answers to those questions, and we may not, but if we're going to get answers to those questions, we've got to do something before we pursue those questions themselves. We've got to ask ourselves a very simple, basic question. Is reason up to the challenge of answering those questions? Is reason capable of answering those questions? And to do that, we need an inspection, an interrogation. You will call it, in some cases, a tribunal. We need to put reason on trial to see if reason can actually do this. That's what the critique of pure reason is supposed to be. An interrogation, a tribunal of reason to see if it's up to answering the questions of, let's say broadly, metaphysics. What Kant's claim is that we can't do metaphysics before we do epistemology. We have to do epistemology first. We have to answer, famously, the quid juris question. By what right, quid juris, by what right do we know these things we claim to know? That God exists, the will is free, the soul is immortal. By what right do we have the right to know those things? And Kant famously says, look, if you go down the standard route, which has been an utter failure, that question never gets broached, that question never gets addressed, never gets raised. Because it's always presumed, look, reason's up to answering these questions. We just got to figure out the answer to them. We got to find out the proof for God's existence, then we'll be good. We've tried out thousands of them, they're not working. We got to figure out if the soul is immortal, we got to figure out if the will is free. Those have all been dismal failures as well. So Kant says, hey, let's learn something from the other sciences. The other sciences work this way. They say, look, instead of us having to conform to the objects of the world, what if, let's try this. Literally, Kant puts this out as a proposal, a hypothesis. Let's see if things don't go better in metaphysics if we have the world conform to us. Sorry, what? Yeah, so far, the way reason's operated is it just had to grasp the structure of the nature of reality. So is God out there? Is the will free? Is the soul immortal? Those are questions about how those things existing out there in the world, in themselves, are or are not. And so far, the record is dismal. It's a complete catastrophe. We're not doing anything. So let's see if we don't make better progress, if we don't move this way. We don't correct our transform, this is the transcendental term, we don't make a transition where we say, look, the mind doesn't have to conform to the world, knowledge doesn't have to conform to the objects of cognition, but the objects of cognition have to conform to us. Oh, great, I now get to think up things and they are what I want them to be. No, he says, I'm not a Berkeleyan idealist, that's his term. The world is not whatever you want it to be. The world does have to conform, though, perhaps to the constraints you place upon it as a human being. Well, I don't have any constraints, do I? That's what the entirety of the critique of pure reason, most of it, is about. The constraints, the conditions, as Kant famously calls it, that we place upon things to be an object of knowledge for us. Kant famously shows that to be an object of knowledge for us, something has to be somewhere. space, some when in time. It has to meet these qualifications, ones that will come back and we'll see in the science of logic. It has to be qualitative, quantitative, relational, and modal. And Kant's going to say, those are all requirements for all of our cognition, not just for mine, not just Kant's, but for anyone with cognition. They place those constraints on objects, and before an object can even show up for us, we can know that it has to meet those conditions, otherwise it wouldn't be an object for us. So I can know if I'm going to have a table, it's got to be somewhere in some way. It's got to be spatial and temporal. Otherwise it's going to be an object of knowledge for me. It's got to have quality, it's got to have quantity, it's got to have relation and modality. Otherwise it couldn't be an object for me. Anything that can't meet those qualifications can't be an object of knowledge for me. Now that's the argument of the first critique in a nutshell. Notice what that does. It says what's knowable and what's not knowable. What's knowable is things insofar as they are for us. That is, insofar as they conform to the conditions of the possibility of experience, as Kant famously puts it. So something can be something for us if it meets those conditions, space-time and the categories. It's Kantians like to put it. Something meets those categories and those formal conditions, then it can be an object for us. If it doesn't, then it can't be an object for us. So interestingly, we can do a metaphysics now. Great, we can talk about God, freedom, and immortality. No. Why? Because God can't be spatio-temporal. God can't be quality, quantitative, relational, modality. That's just not in the definition of God. So can't know God because God can't be an object of possible experience. Neither can the will, neither can the soul. Oh, crap. You just took away my rational cosmology, my rational theology, my rational psychology. Kant would be, yeah, did exactly that. Because reason can't know those things. We're disciplining, one of the other ways of thinking about critique, we're disciplining, we're insisting on it having borders and limits. Here's the limitations of reason. Reason can't know things as they are in themselves. You can think about those things, but it can't know those things. What's it good to think about it? We'll come back to that. That's the noumenal, right? Thinkable. All they can really know anything about is the world as it shows up for us, the phenomenon, as it is for us, not as it is in itself. Well, how can I do metaphysics? Right? Because all my knowledge is empirical about tables and stuff. That's not metaphysical knowledge. It's not, as Kant taught us, synthetic a priori judgments. We get lost in the details of that, but it's not metaphysical knowledge. Okay, fine. But what can I know? Here's something I can know. I can know that any object, in order to be an object for me, has to be spatial and temporal. And I can know that synthetically and a priori. Before it shows up for me, I can know that. I can know it has to be qualitative, quantitative, relational, and modal. Before it ever even shows up for me. That's the new metaphysics. It's not the big metaphysics we used to have. It's the tempered metaphysics. Kant at the end of the first critique says, this is in the methodology section, we don't ever read that, but it's in the methodology section right at the beginning where he says, look, initially we wanted to climb the Tower of Babel. It goes back to Genesis and gets that image of the Tower of Babel. We want to climb all the way up to God. We don't know if God exists or not. What the critique does is says, no, you can't have it. You can only build a house suited for the plane of experience, he says. And it has a second level. This house, I'm paraphrasing, has a second level where it can see things that are necessarily the case for being possible experience. It just can't know God, freedom, and immortality. Those are beyond. That's the thinkable. It can know the conditions of the possibility of experience, the conditions of the phenomenon. What did Kant do in doing that? He showed a possibility of actually having knowledge of certain things and even having metaphysical knowledge of those things. I know the table. It hurts when right? I know it's here. Right, fine. That's empirical knowledge. That's synthetic a posteriori knowledge. But synthetic a priori knowledge would be, what do I know about it even though it's before it's being experienced? What do I know with necessity? What do I know with universality? Well, I know that anything to be an object for me has to be spatial, temporal, qualitative, quantitative, relational, modality. So this table has to satisfy those, or it couldn't be any of those things. I can know that before. Logically before experience happens. So I can do a metaphysics of experience. Precisely that way. So Kant was giving us a way of doing metaphysics through reason, but a disciplined, restricted, constrained reason. It's constricted and constrained because it says the only things it can know about are the things insofar as they are for us and the conditions of the possibility of things as they are for us. It can't know the things as they are themselves. there's the reason side. Now a disciplined sense of reason, not pure reason a la Mendelssohn, but a restrained reason, constricted reason. What about faith? Kant says, look, I can't know things as they are in themselves. I can't prove to you. There's no proof that it really works. It establishes God's existence, the will's freedom, the soul's immortality. They all fail. Go back and look at them. He says they're all dismal failures. And yet he says, I can believe it. Well, wait a minute. I thought you said I couldn't know anything about them. Right, you can't know them. Erkennen is his term in German. You can't know those things. But you can glauben. You can believe in them. Glauben is also translated as faith. You can have faith. You can hold them to be true. Sorry, why? How's that possible? Because the numinal, things in there in themselves, you can't know those things. But you can believe things about them. I can believe anything about them? No, he says. Just because something's thinkable doesn't mean it's actually an object of faith. That you ought to have as an object of faith. So this is famously where Kant will say, I'm paraphrasing massively, you can't believe in the fairy godmothers and the fairy tales. Those are not things you need to believe in, right? The Easter Bunny. Sorry to break it to you. You can't believe in those things. Well, then why do you believe in God? Isn't God just the Easter Bunny? It's just another fairy tale. Kant famously says, no, God's different. Why is God different? The will is free. That's different. Why? The soul's immortal. That's different. Why? Because all three of those are required for the moral law to be possible. The Easter Bunny is not required for the moral law. Sorry. But God, freedom, and immortality are. The second critique makes this argument in more detail, but it's already in the first critique. God is the lawgiver. You don't have moral laws without God being the lawgiver. You don't have the ability to conform to that law if it's not freely done. You have to be free, so you can't prove that, but you can believe it. And it doesn't matter if you're not going to get your reward here. If you don't get your reward later, then you're going to have to be immoral. Those are the things you have to believe. Those are the articles of a rational faith. I had to restrict reason in order to make room for faith. So there's Kant in a nutshell. And Reinhold convinced a generation of this fact, that Kant had done something and done it amazingly and done it successfully. He had pointed a path between the extremes of pure reason and pure faith, and we ought to follow him down that path. So they all showed up in Jena, not in Königsberg, to go study how to proceed along that pathway. Kant kept publishing, right? He had a few students, but there was no mass exodus off to Königsberg. The exodus was to Jena. Why? Because that's where this message of the critical philosophies was being preached, and most particularly because this is historical stuff you don't have to worry so much with. There was a philosopher that had just moved there that they thought was the author of a new Kantian work. That was Fichte. He didn't put his name to the work, and people assumed that it was called an attempt at a critique of all revelation. It said critique. That's Kant. They all assumed it was Kant. Kant said, no, it's not me, but it's written by an articulate, well thought of new philosopher. That's the imprimatur. Kant resented that. Very disappointed he did that eventually. Because then everyone was going to Jena, because that's where this new philosopher was, Fichte, to go study with. So Kant and Fichte were the critical philosophy. So when you hear this generation that we're about to look at talk about the critical philosophy, they always mean by that Kant in the way that we just talked about in very broad terms, and Fichte along with that, early Fichte in particular. That's the way they think of those figures as working together. So far, so good. A lot there, I know. Usually we would teach a whole class just on that. That's enough to do, but that's a little sketch of what goes on there. Let's get to the monistic term. Aren't we good, right? Can't we just be critical philosophers? Right? I mean, we don't have to go down the terrible route of pure reason and end up in nihilism. We don't have to go down the pure route of pure faith with Jacobi and end up in fanaticism. We can be with Kant, a rational faith person. You know, we have some metaphysical knowledge. It's not the Tower of Babel. It's not God and freedom. We can't know and prove those things, but we can believe them. You know, we got reason to believe. Why? Because the moral law requires them. So it's all good. And we can do some metaphysics too. We can have a critical metaphysics. This is literally what Kant called it. Right? Kant always said. All his other books, besides the three critiques, are called what? Metaphysics of nature, metaphysics of morals, right? Because he's doing metaphysics. He thinks you can do critical metaphysics. So why didn't it all just, get variations on that? Why aren't we all, why isn't everyone after just a Kantian, not a post-Kantian? Well, here's why. All of this was supposed to do what? It was supposed to unify everything. Unify faith, unify reason under this rubric of pure reason. Sorry, rational faith. Kant is incredibly insistent in the first critique. Hegel quotes this all the time. Reason is a unity. Reason is one. Practical side of it, right? Morality. Theoretical side of it, metaphysics, it's all really one. And he says repeatedly, Kant does, that I'm trying to show that that's true, that reason is one, that we're not bifurcated, right? We don't have a rational side that does certain things and another rational side that does other things. Reason is ultimately all one. We're at the core, reason is autonomy. Reason is giving itself the law. Whether that's the theoretical sense or that's the practical sense, it's all ultimately one. The other term for that, we're about to come back to this with a vengeance, the rest of the quarter. Kant would say about that, that means reason is systematic. Reason is a system. It's a coherent unity. More about what a system is later, but that's at least what it is. Kant famously defines system as the unity of reason under a fundamental principle. The unity of all things under a fundamental principle. Fichte literally wrote the Wissenschaftslehre that's about that. What is this fundamental principle? That became the problem. What's the fundamental axiom from which everything else flows? But this is the way they thought. Okay, so sign me up. I want to do that, said everybody who came after. What's the price of it? Oh, phenomenal numeral divide. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. I thought we were going for oneness. But reason is one, right? Rational faith gets us faith and reason reconciled with one another. They're just different aspects of the same damn thing. So, it's all good, right? It's one. God says, yeah, that's what we're going for. That's exactly what we're after. How do we get there? Oh, dualism. Dualism. Yeah, remember? Objects can't be known in themselves. They can only be known as they are for us. The phenomenal, the noumenal. Here's why everybody who's a post-Kantian became a post-Kantian. They were in full agreement with the goal, unification of reason in a system of reason. They were all about that. They thought that's what reason demanded, that's what reason insisted on. But what they departed, why they became post-Kantians, is on the phenomenal noumenal divide. In some form, fashion, or another, everyone who became a post-Kantian will say to you, I agree with Kant about the unification of reason. I'm about to enumerate 3 different schools of the post-Kantian schools, but they all agree about this. We're in full agreement with Kant that we have to seek out the unification of reason. Absolutely. Systematic, yeah, we're sign us up. But they also all agreed about this is what makes them all post-Kantians. We can't go the route of dualism to get there. Dualism can't produce unity. Once you've broken apart the phenomenal and the noumenal, you can't put them back together. Kant arguably wrote a third critique about this, trying to put the two back together, right, through the notion of propulsiveness. He says so in the introduction of that text. He's trying to grapple with how do you put these two things back together. And the claim of the post-Kantians is, nice try, Dad. Paraphrasing. Nice try, Dad, but that doesn't work. Doesn't matter what kind of band-aid you put across the phenomenal and noumenal, it's still a band-aid covering up a fundamental, intractable and irreversible split between the phenomenal and noumenal. That's why the post-Kantians are so obsessed with saying what we need is knowledge of the absolute. Because what they meant by the absolute, minimally, what they meant by the absolute, meant a lot of other things. What they meant by the absolute is we need to have knowledge. They knew what that term meant. Knowledge of the in itself. You can't have knowledge of the in itself. That's unconditioned. You can't have knowledge. Kant taught us that. Yeah, but look at the price we're paying for dualism. Now, all of them would agree Kant's dualism is not just Kant's dualism. It's a symptom of a broader cultural, intellectual problem of dualism that we see all over the place. That separates things from one another, God from humanity, humanity from nature, individual from community, duty from desire, virtue from happiness, mind from body. So the phenomenal noumenal divide is just one more of those dualisms. It's what Hegel would ultimately call, this is Hegel's term for this, alienation. Splitting of those two from one another. He says it's different in the first writing of the difference between Schelling and Fichte's philosophies. That's an alienation. So what do? Well, you need a monistic turn to complete the Kantian project. This is kind of counterintuitive, but think through it just a moment. They're all Kantians, right? All the group of people we're about to talk about. I'll name some. We'll focus on, obviously, Hegel and Hegel and others, but they're all Kantians because they agree with the Kantian project. They're all, first critique, we're all about it. Rational faith, yes. But then also, no. Why? Because you can't get to where we want to be, where Kant wanted to be. You can't complete the Kantian project through the Kantian methodology. Right goal, wrong way to get there. So what do you need? You need a monistic foundation. The only way you can have the unity of reason is to start with unity at the foundation of all things. This is the monistic term. The one. Monism. Oneness. Now there are three kinds, you can number them different ways, enumerate them different ways. There's three kinds of post-Kantian monism. We're going to focus on one of them, but it's useful to have all three of them out so you're aware of them and kind of establish where these post-Kantians are in relationship to one another. So here's three kinds of monism. We'll focus on the last one. So the first kind of monism we'll call epistemic monism. Epistemic monism. And it says, look, we want the unity of reason, we're Kantians, but we're post-Kantians because we want it founded in something that's unified, not this phenomenal divide. So we want it rooted in a single, apodictic, absolutely certain, principle, an axiom. Here, epistemic monism, it's about knowledge. This is early Fichte, early Reinhold. So notice, their concern was always, what's the fundamental axiom? They use axiom like you use it in geometry, right? And unprovable fundamental. Right? They pull this in from Spinoza, right? Where he has all these axioms and in the ethics. He says, look, these, I can't prove these things, you just have to grasp them, you have to know them. What was the term he used for that? Oh yeah, intellectual intuition. You can't prove any of these axioms. You have to know them through the third kind of knowledge, as Spinoza called it, intellectual intuition. They adopted that term. It was already in Kant as well, but Kant said, humans don't have intellectual intuition. God does, maybe, as a kind of comparison with us. We have discursive intellects. He has intellectual intuition directly. He has an intuitive intellect. We don't. Well, Fichte and early Reinhold said, maybe we do about this. Maybe we can grasp the fundamental principle of all things through intellectual intuition. Everything else is discursive. Everything else will have to be provable. But those axioms are that one single. So that's epistemic monism, briefly described. Early Reinhold, early Fichte. The next kind of monism is practical monism. Practical monism. It says, look, we're after the unity of reason as well, but we can't go to the phenomenal numeral divide to get it because that'll always, always be a disaster. So what are we going to root it in? An axiomatic principle? No. We're going to root it in the unity of human dignity. The unity of human dignity. Hence, practical monism. Right? It's about the unity of human flourishing. Well, who is this? This is Schiller, Herder, Kant students, by the way. This is early German Romanticism, so people like Schlegel and Novalis. They were all saying, look, if you want a fundamental unity, the only unity that's to be had is the unity of the human person. Schiller famously said, we're rational beings and desirous beings, and those are integrated into one another. How are they integrated into one another? They're off het. They're sublated into one another. That's literally where Hegel got the idea, if you want. History. Schiller. Herder thinks the same thing in different ways. The early German Romantics also. So there's epistemic monism, practical monism. I'm not going to explore either one of those. If you're looking at post-Kantianism, though, you would look at those different strands. They're rich. I urge you to explore those figures. They're amazing figures, every last one of them. Right? And they don't get appreciated to the extent that they should because we focus on the big ones that come out of this, right? But I do think they're worth your time. We're going to talk about ontological monism. Ontological monism is the name for the thought that was shared by three seminary students who shared a room with one another for a time, very short time. But they were lifelong friends. And this is kind of mind-blowing. right? So hold on to this for in Tübingen, in the seminary in Tübingen, there were 3 young people going to, pursuing the pathway to be pastors. So they were in the seminary. They shared a room with one another. One of them was pretty sickly. That's Hegel. So he didn't stay around as much as he could. One of them was really young, was a prodigy. That was Schelling. And the last of them, who was the same age as Hegel, pretty much, was Herderlin, the poet. Now, here's the short story I want to tell about ontological monism. It works like this, right? The core belief of that group is that you can't root the unity of reason in an axiom. So they reject epistemic monism. They're well aware of it. Right? They know it. They read. Tübingen was reading constantly Jena's works, right? The works come out of Jena. So they were well familiar with that. They read the critique and all this sort of stuff. It was taught by their professors. They didn't think that would work. They didn't think the practical monism would work either, for various reasons we can talk about. It wasn't grand enough. It wasn't big enough. It's just about human beings. And that looks like a variation on the Kantian thematic. They thought you had to go bigger. What's bigger? Being. The unity of reason has to be rooted in the unity of being itself. Now, the first one of the 3 of them to come up with that idea, as far as we can tell, 1795, that's why that year is important, in a little fragment that Herderlin wrote. Herderlin didn't do a lot of philosophizing, but when he did, it was pretty monumental. There's a fragment called Being, Judgment, Possibility that we recovered, we have. It's on 2 sides of 1 page, that's all it is, and it's fragmentary. But it lays out this idea. It says, the only way you can do what Fichte is claiming, which is that the fundamental axiom is the I equals the I, self-consciousness. The only way you can have self-consciousness is if you have subtending that the unity of being itself. You couldn't have the self-identity of self-consciousness if that wasn't predicated or built upon something more fundamental. And that more fundamental must be the unity of being itself. He called it pure being, or being as such. Now, he did some wonderful other things about that and taking that into his poetry and reflects on his poetry. It's worth its own study. It absolutely is. But without that insight, as far as we can tell, Herderlin's insight, you don't get Schelling and you don't get Hegel. Because both of them are disciples of Herderlin. They really are. They learned at the feet of Herderlin at that point. They thought, oh my God, you're exactly right. Because if you look at Schelling's early stuff, you look at Hegel's early stuff, they're basically Kantian. They're Fichteans. Particularly if you look at early Schelling, he's a Fichtean, right? He's a Fichtean that basically gets assigned by Fichte, hey, you go figure out what the Naturphilosophie, the philosophy of nature ought to be. He goes like, oh yeah, I'm all about it. And Hegel in his early writings is basically kind of Fichtean on the practical side of things, right? You look at his early, the Tübingen essays, you look at the other early writings, he really is like almost a practical monist than anything else. So what revolutionizes them both, Schelling and Hegel, into being what they are, is the monistic turn that Herderlin, their seminary classmate, took. They stayed in contact with him. They had long discussions with him about these matters. It's been documented. We know that they took from him these ideas. And that little fragment, being, judgment, possibility, is really good evidence for the thought of Herderlin, the philosophical thought of Herderlin, underpinning his, you can see it then in his poetry, early, middle, and late. You can see it thinking about this. And you can see it remnants in Hegel. You see it also in Schelling. But you can see it in Hegel really clearly, as I'm about to show you in the preface, because he says, Hegel does, we have to think in the element of the concept. We have to think in the ether of the concept. Element and ether are Herderlin's terms for being and subtending self-consciousness. You can't be aware of yourself unless there is some subtending unity, the ether of being, that makes that identification possible. So union, says Herderlin, precedes identity. Now, Schelling, who's the younger prodigy, right, picks up on this first and launches into Schelling's trajectory of development. Right? Let's call it that. Hegel used to say he conducted his philosophical education in public, right? Which was a pejorative, right? That's, you don't want to be showing everybody how you're learning stuff, right? But he would just, he was a prodigy. He would lay things out. He was ahead. And there was a time in which Hegel was a full-fledged Schelenian. He didn't cut that cord until 1807. The phenomenology of spirit is his declaration of, nope, I'm not going down that route. Can't do that. That was his break with Schelling, among other things. It's his break with Schelling. What did they break about? They broke about two things that Schelling had inherited from Hölderlin. So the nature of being, number one, and the mode of access we have to being, intellectual intuition. Here's what Hegel does. Hölderlin had already said, Schelling followed him in this. Schelling did it in a more elaborate way, but the basic idea is already there in Hölderlin. That being is a unity, it's a fundamental unity, and then everything that we see around us, because everything's not a unity, there's diversity, differentiation all around us, there's determinacy around us. That all arises out of the unity of being itself, through what Hölderlin had already called an originary separation, originary division, Urteilung. So he plays on the German, right? Hyphenates something that's not hyphenated in German. Originary. It really just means judgment. That's why being judgment, this is the judgment part of the little essay, the little fragment. He splits it. He says it's Urteilung. It's originary Teilung, separation, division. Schelling picks up on that. You're going to see Hegel pick up on that as well in a different way. It's in the logic. And he says, well, that's how everything arises out of the fundamental unity that is being. You get determinants, you get the world. Right? That's why you get a table over here and a table over there, you get humans over there, humans over there, by virtue of that. But everything underlying it, subtending that, is unified in this oneness of being itself. So how do I know the oneness of all things? Through intellectual intuition. I grasp it immediately. Kant told us only God can have that. Hölderlin said, actually not. We've got it. We're able to grasp this. If we didn't grasp this, we couldn't explain how anything could be identical with anything else, because we have to grasp the underlying unity that makes those identities possible. So for me to say I, and I again, and I once again, and I'll put it in Kantian language, for all my I thinks to be able to be unified in the synthetic unity of I perception, is subtended on the principle, on the basic fact of the unity of being itself. And I grasp that through not discursive intellect, not provable, but directly see it. Schauen. That's what it means, to see it. I see it, I grasp it. It comes from, Meister Eckhart gave us this term, right? Intellectual intuition. In German, he introduced this notion of you can see these things directly. And he was trying to capture what was in the medieval period was called contemplatio, right? Contemplatio, and what had been theoria in Plato. You can see these things. Nous, that mysterious thing in Aristotle's metaphysics that we see things directly. So this is intellectual intuition, and Hölderlin saying you just grasp that directly because it's a fundamental unity, and then everything else from there is differentiated. So being is one, it gives rise through Urteilung, through originary differentiation, to everything else. Difference is derivative, secondary. Primary is oneness of all things. So far, so good. This is Schelling's philosophy in a nutshell as well, by the way. This is the early nature of philosophy, is trying to figure out how do you get differentiation out of the oneness? How do you get contravailing forces? That's what his explanation of the Urteilung is, right? You have the force that constricts, the other force that expands. This is him trying to grapple with that same problem. Here's where Hegel breaks. Here's what makes, frankly, Hegel Hegel. Hegel says, I'm with you on the fundamentality of being. I agree. The epistemic route, fundamental axiom, no. That won't give us the unity of reason. The practical route, the fundamental grounding of all things in the unity of human dignity, that won't give us the unity of reason. The only way we're going to get the unity of reason is in the unity of being. Hegel will say, I'm all on that. So he's an ontological monist. But here's where he differs. This is the break from Hölderlin and from Schelling. Difference is not derivative. Difference is fundamental to being itself. Being is difference. Better said, being is differentiation, because it's a process of differentiation. Now, with that claim, which he would call by many names, right? The phenomenology of spirit, that's spirit, by the way. In the science of logic, that's the concept, that's the idea. So when he's calling it these things, this is ultimately what he's trying to think about. It goes back to these roots in the fundamental nature of being. He starts off the book by what? When we actually started the book proper, not when the prefaces, the introduction, and the little weird thing about with what must the science of logic begin. We get past all that. We start where? Being. He says, being, pure being. That's like, I mean by this what Hegelian meant by this. Just the pure existence of things themselves. But then he argues that the only way that's possible, this is Hegel, is through differentiation. The logic of the concept. The necessity of the concept. The movement of the concept. The idea. Which he, unsurprisingly, uses the notion of Bertillon, originary differentiation. Now he thinks it's really originary, right? Because it's actually in being itself. It's not secondary. It's not the second thing that happens to being that's a fundamental unity. It's right there in being itself. Okay, do we grasp that through intellectual intuition? No, Hegel wrote a 400-page book called The Phenomenology of Spirit that argues precisely against intellectual intuition. That's at its core. All of our knowledge is through and through discursive. We know the absolute, he's arguing. We know the absolute. We know the in itself. He starts off the book, see it already in the preface. We know things as they are in themselves. We want to know things as they are in truth, as he calls it. But we know it not through intellectual intuition. We know it through discursive intellect. We know it through concepts, not as subtending concepts. So absolute knowing in that book, which is what the rest of this is going to be about, is knowledge of the in itself. We know the in itself not through intellectual intuition, but precisely through categories, precisely through concepts. So we don't just see the absolute, we know the absolute. And we know it as a matter of the logic of the process of differentiation. It has a categorical structure. Being has a categorical structure. We can spell it out. We can spell it out exhaustively. That last bit, that we can do it exhaustively, that there's no remainder, there's nothing left over, that we don't miss anything, that we can capture the nature of everything, that's going to set him at odds with Schelling. Schelling is going to articulate the critique that we still live with of Hegel. That critique is wrapped around this word called panlogicism. Mouthful, we'll come back to it next week. That everything is accountable in terms of its logic. Literally everything. Schelling would famously say, well, there's something that exceeds the logic of the concept. Hegel would say, nothing can exceed the logic of the concept. There's the difference. So, if that makes some sense, then you can put all that under the rubric of Hegel is an arch rationalist. He really does believe that reason can know all things as they are in themselves. And you want to say, no, I read the first critique. We can't. Right? The in itself, we can't. Hegel wrote a 400-page book that he thinks demonstrates precisely that we do know that. That's what the phenomenology's argument is. It's a 400-page work of epistemology about that. Now, if that makes some sense, then Hegel's project, there's is problematic. Coming out of this ontological monism is differing of himself from Hegelian and Schelling on these fundamental issues. Then the project of the science of logic, what is that? To lay out that post-critical metaphysics. What's the categorical structure of reality? I said flippantly. It's just that. Now, we're going to take a break. Hegel's well aware that you can't just say that stuff. You've got to establish and justify your warrant to saying that stuff. So he's going to be worried about the quid juris question. Even though he's written a 400-page book devoted to that. He doesn't think that's the only way of getting to this place. This standpoint of absolute knowing. He's constantly obsessed with this. This is what that little piece of what must the science of logic begin is really about. How can we claim to know the end itself. So we'll talk about that as we move along. So this epistemological question and this metaphysical question, obviously related to one another in Hegel. We'll grapple with those along the way. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and look at the preface of phenomenology, preface to the science of logic to get some handle. Thanks. So 4:55.